see if I can cancel a thing. Adam, talk to me about when you first got into RAJAR whilst I do this.
When I first got into RAJAR, gosh, it's a long time ago now, back in the late 90s, joining Virgin Radio and suddenly finding out I was in charge of the station's RAJAR data when I knew nothing about RAJAR. So learning on the go, that's always good. Getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, because RAJAR used to be published very early in the morning, as I'm sure a lot of people remember. Having to actually get to RAJAR's offices, always good in the middle of the winter.
So explain that. So what about going to the offices? How did that work?
Well, the station was nice enough to send you a cab. You'd get up at about 4:30 in the morning, get in the cab, get taken to the offices. It was like getting your exam results. You sat around with a bunch of people you saw every quarter doing the same thing. Led into a room, signed for your sheet, got a box or an envelope, depending on how big a group you were. Then rushing away and back to the station where your managing director or whatever would be hanging around saying, so go on, how good are they? How good are they? And you'd be desperately trying to do mental arithmetic sums before you could get it into Excel. So the offices, it was like getting your exam. Hearing a bit of feedback there. Yeah, and you got your data on a floppy disk too. So it was printed sheets and a floppy disk. Load up the data off the floppy disk.
Nice. So it's slightly different now. So,
very much so.
If you don't know, RAJAR at 10:30 sends a link to all subscribers, which only goes live at 10:30, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And then they've got until midnight that night to crunch the numbers and create their press releases. Although in reality, of course, if you want to send something out, you send it much earlier in the afternoon, sometime mid-afternoon. So probably between 10:30 and sort of 2 o'clock is sort of feverish activity amongst most radio stations, as the people doing the analysis are rushing around trying to work out what's going on and getting their stories put together.
Yeah, it's difficult because sometimes there's very obvious stories about your own radio station. Sometimes there's abject horrors. You realize pretty much there's no good stories. And you try and think, oh God, how can I say something positive to everyone? Yeah,
I think it was Phil Riley who posted some emoticons today, sort of suggesting there was always that. But our 35 to 45 mid-morning numbers are really going through the roof, as being your last resort when you're desperately looking for those good numbers, somewhere buried in there amongst a sea of negatives.
So on this quarter's RAJAR, so what are the key things that you've noticed, Adam?
Well, overall, radio looked pretty well. I mean, I think just to make clear for anyone who hasn't sort of been totally across all of this, this RAJAR ended just as we were going into lockdown, so most of the data really predates that. In overall terms, it's been a good quarter for commercial radio. They're up a bit, and radio in general is back up a little bit. There's been lots of concerns, I think, in recent quarters about radio slipping. It did fall below 1 billion hours a couple of quarters back, and that's always been seen as a sort of benchmark about how much listening is going on, because there are clearly challenges, especially at the under end for streaming. But actually even 1524s are up a little bit this quarter, which is good, because they're always seen as the sort of the sort of people to keep an eye out, because if they fall out of love of radio or something, then that becomes an issue. But they're up this quarter. As I say, commercial radio did well. LBC had some incredibly good results. We can talk about that if you like for a bit. Six Music had good numbers. Radio 2 slipped a little bit. Radio 1 sort of fairly mixed, although it's up on the quarter. And then some of the big groups, I mean, overall the big groups did okay, although some of the big brands didn't do quite as well as others. So I think Magic did well, Capital and Heart less so. But there's always quarterly variances like that. And then I think that Speech had an amazing time last quarter because it was the general election, and that obviously was a bump for most of the news stations. And although we are now probably in the most news intensive time, you know, even after general elections and Brexit and everything, speech has slipped a little bit overall in general. If you just consider speech as the main speech stations, lots of stations are doing lots more speeches, I think.
I mean, looking at the commercial radio had a good book, didn't it? I mean, sort of nearly highest ever. I think highest ever reach in numbers, pretty high percentage. I think not quite the highest, but pretty much the highest. And similarly with market share, because a lot of that is driven by digital and the digital growth, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously we've seen a lot of, you know, Hearts and Magics and Absolute and, you know, digital, you know, sister brands, sub brands, if you like, and they are all delivering, you know, some audiences, and I think that's where a lot of that sort of growth's coming from, across the board. Those kind of, you know, the Ron Seal stations, as you might call it, you know, they are what they say on the tin. 80s, absolute 80s. You know what you're getting.
I mean, do you think, I mean, just want to say hello to Rodders, who's just left a comment. If you want to leave a comment, you can leave it in the YouTube comments, live comments box, or on Twitter, hashtag RAJAR stream, and we'll try and pick that up or after comments or questions. Let's try and do some live runs. If people want to know some data, we can have a look at that too. Adam, on those spin-off stations, do you think it's cannibalizing the kind of the mothership, or is it bringing new people in?
It's a bit of both. I think if you look at some of them, I think that there's always that, you know, if anyone's going to have our listeners, it will be us kind of mentality. So yes, some of our listeners love the 80s songs that we play, so we're going to hive them off into our own 80s stations, and be aware that, you know, the main Heart or Absolute or whatever might lose some. So there's definitely some of that. Some of it is absolutely new people, because these are, as I say, very clear propositions, you know, on the dial. You know, if you tune into a station with 90s after it, you know basically what you're going to get. And, you know, the DAB dial in particular, because, you know, DAB still drives, you know, does drive such a large amount of listening of these things. You know, that dial, as you see it, is basically your ad chance, you know, the words of that station. So oh, I've never heard of this, but it says 90s after it, I know what I'm going to get. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt, and it's always interesting to see to what extent stations do or don't cross promote their own sort of sister brands. You know, different stations have different kind of attitudes to that. I mean, the important thing is, from a commercial perspective, a lot of times the whole lot is being bundled together, so they don't necessarily really care. It can vary in some places, like FM in London may still have some CPT and have some cash benefits that your FM in London, because traditionally it's always driven it. But in general, you're bundling the whole lot together anyway, and selling the Heart network, or the Heart brand, I should say, or the Absolute Radio network, or something like that. And, you know, as long as you're somewhere in there, they're not too fussed. Yes, you as a presenter might be a bit annoyed that, you know, the people listening at 4 o'clock in the afternoon might be listening to 3 variants, 3 alternatives from your same station group. But as a overall, you know, that doesn't matter so much. So
is it pretty much all about total hours then? So kind of network reach numbers less important from a commercial perspective?
I mean, hours, look, commercially, hours is always the driver, right? But you don't get hours without reach. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts there. You want to get people in, and you want to keep them there as long as possible. So, and also, you know, when you want to shout about it, no one understands hours. It's no good, you know, or talking about share. You know, in many markets you talk about share. You know, that's a trade thing. You know, if a radio station plays a sweeper talking about its share, it's really not going to be particularly helpful to the listeners. I mean, you say, hey, we're number 1. That's great. I understand that. And if you say, I've got 100,000 people listening at breakfast, I also understand what that means. But, you know, commercially, obviously, is the hours and the share that brings that count.
So just looking at some questions, question from James Cridland, who's joining us from Brisbane. Hi, James. He's talking about platform growth or lack of platform growth. So from memory, analog's about 41% of all listening, DAB's about 40%, and then internet about 15, and DTV 6-ish. Has DAB stopped growing? Is all the growth coming from online?
I think it's probably varies a little bit. I've not dug into these numbers this quarter yet, but it varies a little bit by demographic. Undoubtedly, at the younger end, what we definitely have seen is a lot more people using apps and things. I mean, you know, things like BBC Sounds and the Global Player and so on. You know, these things are being pushed hard, and the younger listeners, you know, are probably less likely to own a physical radio. So you know, streaming it. I mean, irrespective, by the way, of how we're listening now, and whether we're doing a little bit more, we're sitting in our homes on our laptops. And you've got smart speakers, right? You know, I mean, smart speakers, the two things they can, well, there's a number of things they can really do really well. What's the weather? But play radio. It's really simple. And, you know, there's a lot of those. So, yeah, that's been growing. But, I mean, you know, that DAB is still way bigger. And the growth may have slowed a little bit, but I think it's always been kind of slow and steady, that kind of DAB growth. There's never been a massive, you know, literally everyone bought one this Christmas. I mean, lots of them do get sold every Christmas, but you know what I mean.
I mean, I think there is a thing about I sort of tried to touch it on the blog this morning, this sort of owned platforms, which are kind of FM and DAB, and the sort of platforms that we're on, you know, other people's platforms, be that kind of smart speakers or TuneIn or even DTV, where, you know, it's not really ours. And I think as a sector, we're quite lucky that we've got, you know, our own boxes, as well as sort of reaching out and being in other places too. I mean, I always think with smart speakers, there's a big danger if you're at a radio station, because you see all the streaming data. And we've seen in lockdown for Fun Kids, a huge kind of growth from that. You know, what we don't know perhaps how much is a replacement of existing, you know, broadcast listening. And are we losing listeners in aggregate, but we only are seeing kind of day to day those streaming numbers increase?
Yeah, I mean, you know, some of it's undoubtedly replacement. You know, I know in my bedroom I'm listening on a streaming device where once I listened on a broadcast radio device, you know. So you know, in aggregate, as you say, it's no more radio listening. I'm still listening, and I'm listening to basically the same things too, but I'm just listening on a different platform, because I can shout at it from my bed without actually reaching and pressing a button. I think, you know, there's a whole interesting thing, of course, as well, that once you get right into stations' own platforms, they've got more data and they can monetize you better. So there's that whole, or they can find out more about you, you know. So BBC with Sounds, or you know, all the commercial groups as well with their big apps and so on. When they've got that demographic data, they've got a lot capturing a lot of stuff, so it's kind of in their interest that they can monetize it well to push you.
Yes, there's a question from Steve Doherty. He's saying, will the shift to digital, so not just DAB but kind of more streaming, eventually give us a better take on definitive numbers? You know, RAJAR always gets a kick in for being, you know, a survey. Is that IP data going to be more valuable for radio stations, or is getting everybody captured in a diary a better way of doing it?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to any of this stuff. I mean, don't forget, if you've got a stream, I don't know who's at the end of that stream. Are you streaming that to your entire family, or sitting around listening to the stream? Is it just you? And do I know who you are anyway? So you've kind of got all that. That's why, you know, and you can look wider things. You know, Netflix really talks about individuals. They talk about, you know, the number of streaming occasion. I can't remember the exact term they use, but because they don't know if you're watching Tiger King on your own or with your whole family. So you've got things like that. You've also got the fact that streaming is only a relatively small proportion of it. You know, radio's strength, you know, think of the car, you know, holding your stream together, particularly in more rural locations. Yeah, 4G, 5G, we're going to see better data, better everywhere we go. But, you know, more people by far listen to the broadcast version. So it's going to be quite a long time before that shift has changed entirely. And even then, you're still going to have to do quite a lot of work to try and dig into those numbers to work out what those streams actually mean.
Also, I think the volume, it's about 20,000 people a year on RAJAR that are surveyed, isn't it? No, more than that. How many people are surveyed a year?
100,000.
Yeah.
It's about 25-ish thousand a quarter.
Yes. And when I was looking at that, it's basically the equivalent of the election exit poll, isn't it? It's that sort of volume. And what you tend to find, particularly with national radio stations, it's a really robust sample for capturing data, and it sort of seems counterintuitive sometimes, but it's really robust. I think as you get to smaller radio stations, they sort of round 2 or 4 quarters to make it more robust. But it stands up pretty well even against some of the digital devices, wristwatches in other countries and things like that. Also, I always find that when we have a streaming hiccup on some of our radio stations, we obviously clear off a load of listeners and it sort of drops to 0. Actually, it comes back at about half, 2/3. You think, well, actually, was the other half and the other third, were they listening anyway, or was it just a device that was had the volume turned down? You never quite know, do you, at the end of the stream?
Yeah, RAJAR, is incredibly complex, and I think when you think about every local station in the country, has to have a survey done in their area that covers them and their competitors. I can't remember what the numbers are, but it's like there's several hundred. If you think of like a postcode map of the UK, and then think of that as kind of like a RAJAR map, because you need enough sample in the area that you've deemed to be your survey area, TSA in the trade, but and you've got this jigsaw of things, and of course the area you decide is your area does not neatly match your neighbouring station's area, who also think they've got about half your area, and so you've got to sort of build this enormous patchwork to get up to speed, and it's incredibly complicated. And that's really why you can't also measure community radio, because then you're getting into tiny areas.
Yes.
And the cost of the survey would just skyrocket.
Let's bring in a guest, if we can do that. This is Kate Cocker. Kate's worked in radio at a whole different range of radio stations, but I was interested to get her views on what it's like to get RAJAR on RAJAR Day and what that means. Hi, Kate.
Hi. So ask me again. So
you ran Key 103.
Yeah.
You've been at Six Music, you at GWR stations.
Yeah.
So at Key, in your reign, what was it like at 10:30 when that link drops in your inbox?
Well, the nice thing about being in Manchester was that we had more than one station. So often what we would do, you would find, is all of us hiding in a glass box and sitting there waiting on the laptops for the numbers to drop, much like Adam was saying, that moment where everyone goes, right, they're here, and everyone kind of braces and goes, is this number going to be good? Is it going to be bad? And what's it going to be like compared to everybody else? Is the kind of 3 things. And the person across the desk is running a different radio station to you, and you're like maybe Key 2 or something like that at the time it was, and they're hoping that their numbers are good, and we're hoping our numbers are good, and then you've got your boss going hoping that all the numbers are good. So it's quite nerve-wracking. And then with the more that you go through, the better you get at the process, which is that at that point, you've then got to start, as Adam said again, processing the numbers and getting them back to the people that need them at the higher level, so that then they can do the press releases. Meanwhile, you're very aware of the sales team who are suddenly flurrying around you and chucking over your shoulder, going as if they don't know, but they do know, going, oh, is it all right, like that. So, and for a commercial radio station, that's absolutely where the priority lies, is for that local sales team to get hold of their their clients and go, it's still okay, or it's better, or if it's gone down, this is the story that you need to know. And that is probably the priority at that point in the station. And then, and different radio stations do it at different times. So with Six Music, as a producer at Six Music, you'd get the email on the Thursday morning with everything in it. And I was at Six Music at a time where it just kept on going up. And I mean, it's still going up, but it was a really exciting time, because it was sort of, I think they'd had the boost off the back of the shutdown potential, because that gave them a lot of press and they got a lot of RAJAR out of that, and it leapt up. And then I think you kind of were waiting for that moment where it would sort of dip again, but it never really did, and it just kept on going up and up and up and doing well in the digital space. But at Key 103, then we would do a 4 o'clock in the afternoon meeting, and I was talking to someone this morning actually who was saying that they used to spend Wednesday night practicing what they were going to say to the staff on Thursday. And I sat there and I was talking to Tim and I was going, I don't remember practicing what to say to the staff, because we were just straight in and talking to them at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, going, don't tell anyone, like that. So, and that's a really difficult meeting, that is, because if you've got what's essentially a fall, you're still trying to keep morale up, but everybody is onto RAJAR. Everybody's got a reason why. Oh, I've just dropped out. Have I dropped out? No.
Right.
No. Sorry, all getting used to it. You're trying to keep everyone's morale up, but at the same time, everybody's onto RAJAR and has their own way of working through it, don't they? So everybody knows that if you had a really good book, that probably that's one person, so we shouldn't take it too seriously, although then everybody does and everybody's in the pub within minutes. Or if the numbers are going down, you're going in at a granular level trying to find the story of where the numbers are actually going up and it's okay, and all of that, and everybody then comes to sort of 4:30 going, well, it's much of muchness anyway.
What were the numbers that you looked at? What was important to you as a programmer?
Well, I was always really interested in, well, it's all of them, Matt. First of all, you go reach, then you go hours, and hours is really important for the sales team. Then I was always interested in average hours, and then market share.
What about from a programming the radio station point of view? Is the data usable to judge whether you're doing a good job?
It's that lapse, isn't it, in time that makes it so difficult. So you constantly not. So in answer to your question, it's difficult. You have to trust your ears. You have to trust your guts. And you can look at a bit of RAJAR strategy, like understanding where there might be quite a few books, so that maybe you put a bit of effort into certain areas of the market, so that, if there are a conurbation of stations in one area, there are probably more books there than there are in other places. So actually, what are we doing in, say, Bolton? It's this station that means that we're getting more listeners there, so that they're remembering us better, so that then they're putting the ticks in the diary. But in terms of programming, you're constantly just looking at the hours, I think, is the main one, is just making sure that we're getting listeners and they're staying or coming back. Yeah,
that makes sense. Have you had a look at this quarter's RAJAR? Anything that catches your eye? You must always look at your old stations.
Yeah, of course I do. Of course I look at the stations, but I think for Manchester, I think it's the Excess Manchester have had the Six Music moment, haven't they? So, this kind of potential for closure, they've been quite open about it. They're very local. They're a good, as in terms of the station, they're very heartfelt and very proud of being Mancunian, and can play the playlist that is what people would probably think of as a Mancunian playlist, and they've benefited from this moment. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens there over the next few quarters, I think, see if they pick up. Because the one thing that was really prevalent at Six Music was, yes, it had that really steep, I can work where my hands is on the screen. Yes, there was that really steep climb at that point when there was the closure, but then it went back to climbing at the same rate it was before. So it's almost like you get that, it got the bump, and then it carried on. And so maybe Excess will experience the same thing there as well. And obviously, my heart, every time I see that Hits Radio RAJAR come through, and it is dropping, there's no two ways about it. And I know what that feels like in that building. My heart absolutely goes out to them, because they are doing everything that they can. They're working really hard. They're putting some great radio together. They've got some great talent on that station. And the numbers don't seem to be satisfying what they probably feel like they're doing. So, that heart sinking moment, I feel it every single time.
Yeah. And it's difficult, I think, for heritage ILRs particularly to find a place. And obviously the global stations kind of 10 years ago, so it switched from ILRs to Heart. And it sort of recreated those radio stations. Obviously, that's something they're trying to do. It's trying to keep the audience but lose the heritage baggage. It's a difficult combination. I think it probably is I see it as the right thing to do, but it's difficult to cut through in a competitive market. And I hadn't really looked at Manchester market share. It's on the blog, mattdeacon.com, but I think around that 3% market share base, there's a lot of people competing for time. Yeah. And also some of the national stations do surprisingly well in that area. So like Talk Sport was particularly high that I hadn't really considered.
Yeah, and I think I love that bit in your blog actually today, because I was looking at it going, I wish I'd thought that when I was running the station, because it's actually quite a comforting way of putting it, which is that, finding that gap, getting that gap, and then expanding in that gap. They're really difficult things to do right now when you've got such strong brands around you. And, for the IRR stations, there are so many factors that play into it. It's not just we want to be able to serve this local area, but it's also our finances are coming from the local area. We need to make sure that the clients that we've got stay with us. And that's a bigger job than I think people allow for. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Kate.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Very good. All right. We'll see you soon. If you want to get involved, you can send a tweet with hashtag RAJAR stream, or leave a comment in the YouTube video box, and I think we get to see that. Had a question. Let's see what I can do with this from Gavin. He says, how's RAJAR going to work this year with everything going on? Will it still operate as normal with diaries and everything, or is it being put on hold? How will it affect year-on-year trends? Lots of questions there. Do we know what's going to happen next quarter, Adam?
We don't yet know. RAJAR will tell us in due course. They put out a statement on their website a few weeks ago as we went into this period. And I know that they're looking at lots of different options. I think do not underestimate how complex this is actually for the whole market research industry. If you think about the fact RAJAR is you place them physically, you go around, people actually come around to your door. It's not they just phone you up or whatever. And actually phoning people up is really hard. I mean, think of the number of calls you don't bother answering because you're pretty convinced there's some kind of spam calls or whatever. So they haven't said exactly what they're going to do. I think it's likely to be challenging. I think there's some interesting things about how we are listening and whether we've even settled into a pattern. If you think about it, listening basically happens during drive time. The radio stations have a very, very traditional peak, which is 8 o'clock in the morning is when most people listen. Just most stations, not every station, but most stations. It drifts off a little bit during the day. People listen during the day, then it picks up again when you drive home, commute home, whatever. And you've got those two drive peaks. If we're not commuting, that changes, but also what we were doing in week 1 of the lockdown is probably different to what we're doing right now. I know personally I was watching the news on TV, listening to the news on the radio all the time, finding out, gathering every piece of information. As time's gone by, I think a lot of us, for our own health and sanity, are not spending every waking minute consuming the news. We need other things to put our minds onto. So how we are mixing our media is going to be, is complex, and I'm not sure there's a simple pattern yet. And those are some of the challenges RAJAR faces. I think it's too, direct answers to Gavin's question, it's too easy it's too early to honestly say. But it's not going to be straightforward. And I've no doubt RAJAR will come out and say something in due course.
Okay, question from Jeff to me. Do you think under 10s should be included in RAJAR? So obviously I run a kids radio station, Fun Kids. RAJAR measures 10 plus, though often it's just 15 plus that are published, though everybody can see 10 plus numbers. It's interesting because RAJAR did used to survey 4 pluses, didn't it, Adam?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. I think there are issues getting a 4-year-old to fill out a RAJAR diary, to be perfectly honest. They might want to colour it in. I'm happy.
Squares,
as long as they column in the Fun Kids column, yeah. I think it was complex. there's a cost to it. I know stations like Radio 1, they care about under 15s as well, but a lot of commercial stations, frankly, don't care so much. And I think that's the biggest thing. If you think RAJAR is paid for by both BBC and commercial radio, it's how that's paid for.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. If you've got a question, whack it in the YouTube comments or hashtag RAJAR stream. I was having a look. It's interesting when obviously we publish our blog posts and it's just what's kind of in our head, and we always miss loads of things, don't we, that other people notice. I think the Radio Today write-ups are really good. There's a lot in there nationally and regionally. And then obviously you get tweets from radio groups shouting about what they do. I think we had a comment from Rodders saying that he enjoys the spin the radio stations all put up. And as we talked to Kate, that's part of the game, is trying to find something good to talk about. So getting those splits is difficult. I think one of the things on under 10s again is just the cost of adding in those people. I think that was the big choice that RAJAR made, wasn't it? So I was distracted on the getting data and getting promo from radio stations on Twitter. I saw some talk about greatest hits, and I think greatest hits have got its best ever figures at the moment. And these are the bits which kind of confuse me slightly, and this is where Adam, hopefully you can help out as well. Right, let's see what I can do with this. So what I'm going to do is right. So this is something that we see when we look at data. That's it. Finally got the right setting. So Greatest Hits Network had its kind of best figures. This is looking at reach of 1.3 million. And I was trying to work out, well, what does Greatest Hits Network mean? Because sometimes it can mean lots of different things. So obviously it includes all the Greatest Hits radio stations on AM and also on FM too. But in this case, actually includes those AM stations in Scotland, and then the kind of the greatest hits, the version of greatest hits that's outside of analog areas, so in some of the digital areas. And it was interesting looking at the growth and where it comes from. So pretty much comparing year on year, those analog outlets, it's about the same as where it is now. And where the growth is coming from is that line which says, Greatest Hits Radio Trading. So that's as far as I understand, that's like the national, not in the analog areas, out of areas number. And that's where it's kind of seeing the growth. I mean, there really is this thing, isn't there, Adam, about out of area digital radio stations and where that audience comes from.
Yeah, in the past, a lot of stations lost a certain amount of data, because if I somehow had put a massive pole on my roof and was listening to an FM station that was way outside my area, it wouldn't necessarily get counted. It might be bundled into other listening, or because I couldn't listen. Obviously, digital comes along, and actually I can listen to any station in the country from anywhere. But now you are definitely getting, DAB, offering it nationally, and also to a lesser extent internet and DTV, and it means that for something like Greatest Hits, they can put it on DAB multiplexes, and people pick it up all over the place. And we've said that these digital, it's not just the 80s, 90s, the branded stations like that. It is something like that. It's coming along. If it's offering the right music mix, then people can listen to it. And it's always worth saying as well, stations actually get to choose their own, aside from London, aside from national, stations get to choose their own reporting area. And there has, in the past, there certainly was, possibly to a lesser extent now, a little bit of a game you could do where you could redraw your area a little bit, including and excluding maybe an outlying town in your region, because your percentage reach and your share wasn't quite as high as it might be. So if you exclude it, your overall share might go up. so you would draw these things, but you know your reach would go down because you were definitely losing listeners. So you'd play this game. But now when you've got these capsules, even if someone does live in a town that is outside your defined FM region, they can get bundled in anyway to the digital number, and so you can build that up. So you know there's things like that going on, and as I was saying before, they're probably selling the network mostly, apart from to local advertisers. That's not the case, but you know the national advertisers are buying the network, and they're getting everything everywhere anyway. So
just conscious of time, what are some things that you noticed particularly from this book?
What else did I notice? I think I said LBC at the beginning. I think they've done really well. This is the first quarter we've had the breakout between LBC. So LBC has obviously traditionally, I think it was the first radio station in the country back in 1972, 73. Anyway, in London. And for a long time now in London, they've had a rolling AM station, which is basically the news on repeat every 20 minutes. And they've put that onto national DAB, and they did that last October. And that has definitely pushed up their numbers. They're doing a few things like, you know, they carry Prime Minister's Question Times on that channel and things like that uninterrupted. So, and that's really had an impact on their things. And while speech overall gained a lot in that general election quarter, last quarter, mostly it's fallen back again. And LBC has hung on to it. So,
I mean, they've really benefited from going from being, you know, a London station for both that FM for 97.3 and the LBC News AM to being two national stations, and that growth in the capital, but also obviously the growth outside of it's really pushed it on to being a true national radio station. Have they partly done better also because there's less competition in the news market?
It's difficult to say. I mean, you know, hey, you know, we can say to the fact, and the piece that you've written about recently, we've got Times Radio coming along at some point this summer. And, you know, I was doing some rough and ready, you know, there's about 18 million people who listen to a speech radio station across a week. So, you know, if you chuck in all the sports stations and so on, I don't think necessarily that there's not competition. I mean, there's Radio 4, there's 5 Live, World Service. You know, there are speech stations out there that are covering the news, as much news as you want. But I mean, you know, I think you know, we're also going to see a new entrant in this space, and by all accounts, a well-funded new entrant that's going to run ad-free as well, which is going to be an interesting challenge that they're going to face. So where that listening comes from, and I know you've got thoughts on this that you've written about, is going to be the fascinating thing to watch in the coming months. As you know, do they persuade new people who don't listen to speech radio because they just don't like the kind of things they've heard so far? Are they trying to win those Radio 4 audiences that listen to the Archers and I'm sorry, not having a clue in an afternoon play? Or are they, as well as Today programme, or are they going to be pulling across from it? Is, you know, LBC going to be their direct competitor? And that remains to be seen. I
mean, I think obviously music radio listeners are probably much more likely to switch around. We sort of train them to sort of self-schedule a little bit. The spin-off stations tend to be quite niche. They scratch an itch when you want to listen to dance music or hits or chill or whatever. I think historically speech audiences are pretty loyal to the station that they choose. You know, Radio 4 has very strong average hours, doesn't it? And yeah, as does LBC. I think prying people off of some of those sort of tentpole programming on those stations might be quite difficult for the Times. I think their opportunity, though, is to bring in a new audience, which convert existing Times readers to maybe consume a bit more speech content, or go after people who are probably music radio listeners and podcast consumers that maybe haven't thought speech radio is for them.
I think the podcast thing's interesting because, you know, pretty much every podcast we listen to is speech. You might have some music in it, and if you do, it's probably illegal unless it was newly commissioned. But we also know separately, because RAJAR published the Midas survey a couple of weeks ago or so, that podcast listening is continuing to grow. I think it's about 18% weekly. So if you add those people into the mix, it's done differently. You can't directly compare and contrast. There's a lot of people listening to speech, and can you grab some of those people? I think it's a really good question. Can you grab some of those people who have got used to the podcast world, but and move them back into broadcast? Or alternatively create compelling podcasts from your broadcast radio, because I'd be amazed if that's not also part of the strategy.
Yeah, I mean, they've got sort of 10, 15 shows which are kind of high quality produced programming as it is, and it'd be strange, wouldn't it, if that didn't appear on the news station. Also announced today that the Sun's Political Editor's moving across to be sort of full time on Times Radio 2. Right.
Yeah,
Last call for questions. Last call for last call for any questions in the YouTube comments is nice and easy on the right hand side. Any other last minute things that you saw in the book this quarter?
What else was there? I think we said Magic had a good quarter. Yep. I think what else was there? I mean, in general, the big radio brands, if you think the national brands, it was a bit middling, I would say, middling down. Six Music, we've alluded to, was good. Always worth noting, Ken Bruce is actually the biggest show on Radio 2 these days, which sort of is that rare thing where breakfast isn't necessarily the biggest show.
I mean, we've seen a bit of a decline. Obviously, 1 million seems huge, but they do have all the listeners as it is, don't they?
When you realise their new total is only 14.4 million. It's sort of, I'm sure there'll be some annoyed faces in Wogan House who kind of go, but we wanted 15, 16, and others are saying, can we have a little of that, please? But yeah, I think no, they were the kind of the main things. I don't think this was a sort of spectacular newsy one with any really sort of obviously challenging things. I think there's obviously some stuff that's going to happen. There's some new there's things happening. Talk Sport, is changing breakfast, or at least giving Alan Brazil less to do in the coming things, and that's after a long time. That will cause some changes, I've no doubt. Obviously, it'd be nice if there's some sport for them too. But we've talked about the Times Radio and so some of the other things.
Yeah, I was looking at some stations obviously are always under the radar for RAJAR. So something like Nation in South Wales is kind of up to about 1 million in total hours. They've seen a lot of growth over the last 5 or 6 quarters. I think Capital South Wales had a very good book, but which kind of pushed them into number 3. But Heart South Wales, very, very poor in that place. So kind of some changes in those areas. I think the core with all radio stations is consistency, isn't it? I mean, it's back to the Zoe thing. Any big change, and they change their breakfast show and their drive time show, is going to create some volatility. I mean, what you want to try and do is get people used to your radio station, trust it, and keep returning all the time.
And it can take easily a year to play this stuff out, really. People are habitual. Talked about speech radio being habitual, but a lot of people are, I listen to this because I like that person, and it's only really when that person changes that you suddenly kind of go, oh, I feel slightly bereft. What am I going to do? And you're not forced to, but you may have to want to look around at that point and see what else there is. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a slowly evolving thing. And then I always say, anytime you see anything too dramatic in one quarter, unless something incredibly dramatic happened on the station, wait for a couple more quarters, everything to even out.
Okay, strategy question. So it's just from Music Channel Archive. Bauer have a difficult line to tread with their recent acquisitions. So this is buying Celador and Wireless Group stations and Lynx FM. Are they looking at mass rebrands or continuation of heritage names? Hits Radio has had a bit of a struggle, as we talked about earlier. Do they just roll out Kiss and Magic?
Good question. I've absolutely no idea what the answer is there. I mean, what they can do, of course, is you can still sell them to advertisers as part of a group. So the one thing they are going to benefit from is being part of that Bauer sales team, and by even whether they change their names or not, you can still decide that certain stations fall into certain groups. And Bauer, I suspect they'll look carefully. I mean, it's interesting the way they've done things in comparison to, say, Global. If it was Global who had bought them, absolutely, the new signs would be up, as soon as the marketing team got round to it. I couldn't say definitively that Bauer are going to do that, but what they can do is they can sort of package them together, which will at least improve the bottom lines of those stations to a certain extent. Then what happens with programming, who knows, and branding.
I mean, I saw they added most of them to their sort of Hits Radio Network advertising page, and added all of them pretty much to the Hits Radio advertising page. I'd expect them to all join the Hits Radio Network. If they're, will Links FM get rebranded? Well, I think it's the same question about whether, Hallam FM will get rebranded, and it'll probably happen at a similar time. I suppose there is a question about some of the stations with newer names, the sort of Sams and Breezes and things like that. Do you sort of carry on with their sort of newer heritage name, or do a bit of a change? You might change them if you group stations together into a region. They've requested for Ofcom sort of sensible, the regionalisation elements that all radio groups pretty much choose. So if they were to regroup some stations that have traditionally had different names, you might use that as an opportunity to rebrand. But, it doesn't seem they've been particularly quick to change anything. I think the Kiss and Magic thing comes up quite a lot. It doesn't look like they have a desire to move away from that kind of greatest hit strategy. I think it's difficult with Kiss and Magic, as being sort of delivered nationally on DAB. It does get slightly confusing trying to execute them locally as well. So I don't imagine that's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, you always run into those things where if you've got three names on your DAB dial that are all basically the same, but you've got the local one, the national one, the one from the region that's just adjacent to you. How the listener really navigates that, probably do it on the basis of, is the signal strength strong enough, and do I get broke up? But I suspect you're right, and you would definitely do it by you'd look carefully at it, because if Links FM, say, is incredibly powerful brand, as I suspect it is in Lincoln, change that at your peril unless you've got really good reason to do it. But as you say, they've kept their branding in a lot of places. Again, look in Scotland. Again, they've been quite wary what Bauer does up there as well.
Great. Well, I think 50 minutes is enough for anybody for RAJAR chat. I hope you've enjoyed our first one. I'm not sure if there might be other ones. Maybe. It depends if we're in lockdown. If there's any interest, get in touch privately if you thought it was good, or if you got any suggestions. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching. It's nice to know that there's some people as geekily interested in all of this as we are. And I guess we'll see you next time. Cheers.